Welcome to the BreakPoint podcast. I'm John Stonestreet. Today on the podcast, we're going to have a conversation that a lot of us probably had around Christmas dinner tables and holiday get-togethers, even though they were limited this year, which is related to the topic. And the topic has to do with the ethical considerations as Christians about the COVID vaccine. We have gotten so many questions. Ranging from the derivation of these vaccines to the administration of these vaccines and everything in between. And just really privileged here to have my good friend, Dr. Ben Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell is no stranger to the BreakPoint podcast and to other BreakPoint training resources. Ben, I think the last time we had you on was talking about kind of a theology of death and dying as part of our short course, which was at the early days of the pandemic. So I think that was the last time you've contributed to us. But I saw an article that you had published along with Andrew Walker and I believe another co-author on the ethical nature of vaccines. And we've gotten so many questions that I really wanted to jump into them. So great to have you back. I'll give the formal introduction, but just wanted to say welcome first.
Thank you. Thank you.
And just for everyone, Dr. Mitchell, for years was the Graves Professor of Moral Philosophy at Union University. He also spent a lot of his career at Trinity International University, teaching on areas of theology and culture, was my professor and the advisor to my master's thesis at Trinity. So it's always a little bit intimidating. One of my other, Ben, I don't know if I ever have told you this, but I preached at Beeson Divinity School in their beautiful chapel there when Graham Cole, who was the other reader for my thesis, and I was kind of really worried that, when you preach in front of your advisor, that if he doesn't like it, he can pull it back. I don't know if that's actually a thing that can happen.
Well, actually, I just got off a Zoom call with Graham Cole, who recalled that he was one of your readers and who had really nice things to say about you and your work. So,
well, that makes me feel
no worries. Or as Graham would say from Australia, no worries, mate.
No worries, mate. That's right. He's a remarkable guy, and I'm so grateful for the influence that both of you have had. But you, in particular, helped shape my understanding of Christian worldview around the question of what it means to be human. And I just can't tell you how often that question emerges. I mean, in contemporary culture, it's kind of the fundamental central worldview question of our culture, and it has to do with so many issues concerning bioethics. Mm-hmm. So
that's exactly right. I mean, years ago, of course, the big question was, is there a God and does it matter? Those questions and controversies go on. But I think you're exactly right. The fundamental question of our day, of our era, is what does it mean to be human, and what difference does that make on issues from beginning of life to end of life and everything in between, including COVID virus and vaccines.
That's right. I mean, it certainly goes to the issue of death and dying, but the other place it goes is it gives us a place to start grounding our theological ethics and grounding our personal ethics. And I just got to say, I mean, one of the things that I thought emerged in 2020 was a new level of politicization, if you could, whatever that word is, a new way of making everything political, which for many, even Christian conservatives, the tendency is to start at what side am I on politically rather than these fundamental worldview questions. And it's a concern of mine as we look at Christians who want to do the right thing, who feel beleaguered and kind of in a position of distrust in the larger culture, that's kind of the place we start instead of these theological and worldview categories where we should start. Do you think that's an accurate concern?
Well, it's certainly been one of my concerns. It seems that it's been difficult to step back from the fray, if you will, and try to get a bigger picture of the landscape. And as you're suggesting, looking at the landscape through theological lenses rather than through either political lenses, cultural lenses, or the lenses that are shaped by the social media that we all are now swimming in. So it's been extraordinary. It's made 2020 for everyone, not just with respect to COVID, of course, but it's made 2020 a remarkable year, and one that I hope we don't have to relive anytime soon.
Well, yeah, amen to that. And look, at the same time, I get the distrust of kind of our news sources and our media sources, and that's actually really where I want to begin. So as the vaccines have rolled out here at the end of 2020, I mean, in many ways, the speed at which this went from a problem to a vaccine is unprecedented, as I understand it, in human history. I mean, it really is. It should go down in history as one of the great achievements of the Trump presidency, working with pharmaceutical companies. We don't get those sort of headlines, positive headlines about the Trump presidency. So I'm not sure we're ever going to see that. But at the same time, I'm old enough to remember, as are you, the fact checkers saying there's no way we're going to get this vaccine until mid 2021 or late 2021, fact checking both the president and the vice president. And yet here we are. So put it in context for us. How historic is the development in this speed? Before we get into the ethical questions, and there are a lot of them, and we're going to get to them, just help us put into context really the speed and of this process. How historic is it?
Well, it's a great place to start, and it is. I mean, there's good reason why it's called Operation Warp Speed, this development of this vaccine, because it's never been done this rapidly, and that causes concern for some. We'll talk about, but I think it is a remarkable achievement, and will go down in history as just that. I mean, vaccines aren't new. We've had vaccines for a long time, polio and German measles and all kinds of type A flu and pneumonia vaccines. We have a history of vaccines, and we've been very deliberate because of some mistakes along the way. We've been very deliberate as a culture, as a nation, as a scientific community about how one develops an effective vaccine to try to assess accurately, as much as possible, its safety on the one hand and its effectiveness on the other, sometimes called safety and efficacy. And the Federal Drug Administration, the FDA, has been set up to help us ensure that we have done due diligence in assessing safety and efficacy. Normally, vaccines are developed over a period of tens of years, not tens of months, but tens of years. And the last phase, it's usually a 3-phase process. The last phase of the process usually involves about 3,000 to 6,000 volunteers and runs for a number of years. So it takes a long time traditionally to develop a vaccine. But under Operation Warp Speed, not only was the vaccine developed more quickly because we had international partners, because it was all hands on deck. We had multiple companies working on this, university settings, commercial settings, all working on this and sharing their data, sharing their information. But the phase 3 trial, for instance, of Pfizer vaccine alone, enlisted 44,000 participants, not 3,000 to 6,000 as in a normal phase 3 trial, but in order to ensure that we had done that due diligence for safety and efficacy, we vastly expanded the number of people who would be included in the phase 3 trial to be sure that as much as possible, we knew this vaccine would be safe and it would do what we hope it would do. Now, there are still questions. I mean, for instance, in a normal phase 3 trial that runs for a number of years, we would know better what the long-term effectiveness is going to be. We would know, is this vaccine, or have a better idea, is this vaccine going to cover us for a year or for 2 years or forever? Is its effectiveness going to be short-lived? We don't know the answer to that yet. What we do know seems to be that the vaccine has very high effectiveness for short-term immunity, and moreover, even if one gets COVID after having the vaccine, the symptoms are vastly more minor than they might be if you had not had the vaccine. Similarly, the second vaccine approved in the United States, Moderna vaccine, had 30,000 participants in its phase 3 trial. So we've run the game at fast speed, but we've also tried to include the players, so to speak, to include many, many more to be sure that this vaccine isn't going to kill anyone. Now, to date, it hasn't. The vaccine's not killed a single person. This will air in the future, and no guarantees that we won't have deaths. But it doesn't seem that this vaccine has lethal potential at this point, and the potential for benefit seems to be very, very high.
Well, Dr. Mitchell, let's talk. Dr. Ben Mitchell, let's talk then about how that compares in a couple other ways, because I think that's really, really important. Obviously, we've seen cause to develop vaccines for things like polio and things that have, that used to just be devastating across the world and are not anymore. And yet the assumptions medically going into the COVID era early on, which, basically led to the initiation of Operation Warp Speed, at some level, they've changed. I mean, we didn't know what the death rate would be. We didn't know about which populations would be so severely affected and how lopsided really that would be, and the issues of comorbidities and all that sort of stuff. So, and a lot of people have pointed to that, basically saying this is like the flu. It's not even a bigger deal. I certainly have known people who have gotten it and have been, it was funny, during the first wave, no one I knew really knew people who got it. Now, almost everybody knows somebody who's gotten the virus at some level or another. And it varies. Some have been symptomless. Some have been, had a rough couple weeks. Our friend Johnny Erickson Tata came down with it, talk about comorbidities and pre-existing conditions. And she seems, again, we're recording and this is going to air in the future. She seems to have been, be doing okay. And others, like a very dear friend, he legitimately thought he was going to die. And he was in much better health, even, certainly than me. This thing seems all over the place. So talk a little bit about how the call to develop a vaccine for COVID compares to some of these other conditions that, obviously we're all happy that no one gets polio anymore. Right. Help us compare that.
Well, I think what struck us early on was how quickly people developed who were going to develop severe symptoms and die, how quickly it happened. And I think that puts in mind the necessity of what we call in ethics and medicine triage. We need to find out who's going to die, what we can do, and we treat the most serious cases first. And so we started a kind of triage mindset that said we've got to get at this, find out what's going on. And one of the peculiarities of this virus seems to be that it finds the weaknesses in your system and it attacks those weaknesses. And for people who have COPD, lung problems, there are lung complications, and we see people put on ventilators. For people that have heart conditions, there are valve issues that develop. And so this virus seems to seek out the weaknesses in our physiology and attack weaknesses. And so we have the phenomenon now of people who are asymptomatic, that is, they have no symptoms, but they're carriers of the virus. We have those who have mild symptoms, who are COVID positive. And then we have so-called long COVID. These are people who not only suffer from the symptoms, if they don't die, suffer from the symptoms for a long time, but then they continue after the COVID has been after they become immune to the COVID, they continue with multiple health issues after the COVID. And so it's not just that their smell never comes back, but they may never be able to resume normal life. And this was, I think, frightening to the health community. Whereas some of the other illnesses that we have vaccines for had a very long trajectory to devastating consequences. Yes, they were devastating, could be lethal, but they had a very long trajectory. This seems to have a very short trajectory. It's a pandemic, not just a chronic condition. So I think that changed the game for us, and it became one in which we needed something like an Operation Warp Speed to find out as much as we could, as fast as we could, about the nature of this virus, and then work on a therapy in the form of a vaccine just as quickly as we possibly could. And so it was all like I said, all hands on deck, all holes barred. Let's get this as quickly as we can. Again, which makes some people nervous.
Sure.
There are still lots and lots of questions that we have about the virus and about the vaccine. But again, because of the number of people working on it, the ethical protocols that are in place to require that safety and efficacy be tested, all those protocols are in place. We just did them more quickly. And because we've expanded the human trials, the phase 3 human trials, clinical trials, we have, I think, good reason to be hopeful that this vaccine is both, in fact, safe and effective.
Historically, when a vaccine like this is developed, is it common that people die from the vaccine?
Well, there's always, if you think about a bell curve, where you have a certain number of people on one end, a certain number of people on the other, and then you have the vast majority in the middle. Every vaccine, in fact, every drug has the potential to be lethal for some people. You can have an allergic reaction to it. Tylenol, acetaminophen, affects some people very, very differently than it does the majority of the population. Public health medicine is about exploring both the margins and the vast majority of people. And every drug in some cases has the potential to be lethal, and every drug has the potential not to be effective at all. But for the vast majority of people, Tylenol is a good drug given the right conditions. For the vast majority of people, I think we'll find on retrospect, I think we'll find that for the vast majority of people, the COVID vaccines are going to be safe and effective. There may be tragedies, and we'll have to think about what that means and how we deal with that. But it's true of nearly every medicine that we have. That's why when you get your flu vaccine, you get this little sheet that asks you, are you allergic to eggs? Have you ever had an allergic reaction to any vaccine? We want to try to avoid the tragedies, and we do what we can to do so.
Dr. Mitchell, I want to go now to the promises real quick. We have a lot of ethical questions to get to, and this conversation, we need to take time. There's too many tweets and too many hot takes and too many headlines that aren't giving us the facts. And I appreciate you just kind of methodically walking us through what we need to know here. What can we expect? Again, before we get to the ethical questions, what can we expect in terms of now that the vaccine is here? What does this look like? Many people are weary. We're weary of lockdowns. We're weary of, limitations. We're weary of loneliness. That's another thing. You and I talked about that back, I think, at the last time you were with us, is, the loneliness factor around this. And I know, even we've told this story of our producer here, our audio producer here at BreakPoint, Steve Ryder, whose wife died during COVID from not having COVID, but that he and his boys weren't able to see her for 3 weeks because of those protocols before she passed away. And that's a wound that's not going to heal for him. That's horrible. So here's the vaccine. Is this going to give us the margins in the space to dial back some of these restrictions? And of course, we've seen some governors clearly reveal how non-essential they think houses of worship are as compared to strip clubs and casinos, right? I mean, no one batted 1,000 during the pandemic. Let's put it that way. So what does the vaccine bring? What's the timetable? What will we see in terms of getting on top of this, the daily rates going down, the death rates, all of that sort of stuff?
Yeah. Let me respond to that in a couple different ways. One, just a reminder to those who are watching that I'm not a physician and I don't want to pretend to be one. I'm an ethicist. I have tried to be careful in my analysis of the sources that I'm getting my information from. But I want to be clear that I'm not a physician. Secondly, I'm glad that I'm a Christian, and I'm glad that most of your viewers are Christians as well, because Christians live in hope. And we live in a really fallen, messy, in some cases, dark world. In fact, I had a friend who I think pointed out to me one day very aptly that if we could see all of the evil going on in the world at one time, we'd probably all blow our brains out. That is to say, it's just a messy, frail, fallen world. Yet, as Christians, we live in hope because we know what the promises of God are, and we know those promises have been underwritten by the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. So we live in hope. So all of that is to say, I believe that based on what we know now, I believe that we will begin to see some of those restrictions lifted, but not quickly, and maybe not even anytime soon. I think we're going to have to continue to live in hope. What the vaccines have done, I think, is give us a glimmer of hope that we will, in due time, find a place where we don't have to socially distance, we don't have to wear masks, we can assemble without fear of contracting a deadly virus, or at least this deadly virus. And so we live in hope, but I don't think we're going to see that at the beginning of the new year. I think it's going to take time, both for the vaccine to do its work, that is, for a sufficient number of people to get the vaccine, and begin to build that kind of herd immunity that everybody talks about. I think it's going to take some time, but I do think the vaccines give us that glimmer of hope that we'll need to persevere under the kind of strictures that we've all felt bound by during the pandemic. Now, I'm not prepared to address, and I don't know anyone who is, all of the different decisions all of the governors across the country have had to make. I'll tell you this about our own jurisdiction. In the city of Jackson, Tennessee, where I reside, we have a tertiary care medical center right now that is overwhelmed with coronavirus cases. And interestingly enough, Jackson, Madison County, where we reside, has a mandatory mask mandate, but the surrounding counties do not. And most of the COVID cases in our hospital right now are from residents of the counties that don't have mandatory mask mandates. So my point is just to say that I think masks and physical distancing, I hate the term social distancing, but physical distancing may be part of our culture for multiple months yet to come. But I think we're going to be able to begin to relax some of those restrictions over time.
Well, let me be the first to echo that there's some language that we've used that we should learn from this, never to use
Right.
again.
Right.
Social distancing is one of them, and a non-essential worker is another.
Yeah. Yeah.
But let's get into the ethical questions. By far, the number one question we hear from our audience has to do with whether these vaccines were derived using fetal cells and what that means. And
Yeah.
That's a really important question. Interestingly enough, by the way, this is kind of an anecdote, but just received a wonderful encouraging email from one of our listeners who is who works on vaccine immunology, that sort of thing, as a pediatrician. That's his kind of area. In fact, he's been working, I believe, if I remember correctly, on Hep C is kind of his area of focus. And he talked about how in his area of study, he has to navigate these ethical challenges of fetal cell derivement and what that means. Our Catholic brothers and sisters have come on different levels of this. I mean, we've got I think the U.S. Council of Bishops that have come down and said, okay, these are okay. There are still some voices in the Catholic Church saying, no, these viruses were derived using fetal cells. It's unethical. Help us think through that.
Yeah, it's a great question. That's where everyone who cares about pro-life issues has to begin. We want,
right.
Is there a complicity with evil? Is there a cooperation with the evil of abortion? So first, let me point it to a source. Your viewers will be very interested in the Charlotte Lozier Institute, Lozier. Charlotte Lozier Institute. David Prentice, who's a scientist with the Charlotte Lozier Institute, and his colleagues have put together a white paper on the ethical provenance or ethical genesis of the various vaccines that are being developed. And they track or trace the vaccines that have cooperation with fetal tissues derived from abortion. In fact, for instance, these first two vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, contain no fetal tissues, were not developed or derived from fetal tissues. There is a test that is used on the vaccines as they're being developed that come from a set of cells that were retrieved in 1973 in the Netherlands from an elective abortion. This test does not contribute to the vaccine in any tissues, any cells, any of the biology of the vaccine, and there's no one who is saying, "Aren't you glad?" Well, I won't say that. No one I know is saying, "Aren't you glad we did this abortion back in 1973 so we'd have these cells?" And no one I know of is saying, "And what we need are more abortions so we can get more cells so that we can develop tests like this." There are other sources now that we have. For instance, I mean, a miscarriage could provide the kinds of tissues that may be needed for these kinds of tests. As tragic as the miscarriage would be, it might provide those kinds of tissues. The Charlotte Lozier Institute tracks that for us, and so it's very, very helpful. I think most of us who would worry that the vaccine, Pfizer, Moderna, some others, would cooperate with evil have been convinced that we are far enough removed from both the abortion that took place historically, but more importantly, the motivation for elective abortion, that we're far enough removed from that's not an ethical problem, especially since it's the test that has been used and not the development of the vaccine itself. Now, let me add this caveat though. What we want to from here on out, what we want to encourage drug manufacturers and vaccine developers to do is to start with a morally clean slate that no one would dispute, so that we don't have to worry about that. We want to begin with a process and with substances, with chemicals and biological materials that are not in any way ethically suspect. If we could begin there, we could put all of our fears about that, at least, to rest. And as you say, some very, very strong pro-life advocates, including the Council of Catholic Bishops, have said that we can deal with this in an ethical way. Mm-hmm. But again, I point you to the Charlotte Lozier Institute and to some other sources like Catholic bishops who are without question in their pro-life commitments to help us think through that. Formally speaking, there is a theology of complicity with evil that you could find in a web search, for instance, and there are protocols for thinking through that in a very systematic way, and that's what Catholic bishops and others of us have tried to do.
It's a helpful exercise even to go through that study, because things, I don't want to say things aren't black and white, but I think we often think about evil as if it's like a rock thrown into a glass of water and you can just pull that rock back out and therefore but evil in the world is, as I think Neil Plantinga's book does such a great job, the brevary of sin, not the way it's supposed to be. It's much more like a drop of dye in the water. Right. Working through this is extremely difficult. But as always, we'll link to some of these resources at breakpoint.org, including the Charlotte Lozier study, which is really, really important and really helpful. Let me go to another question then, because it's also been, you mentioned in terms of pharmaceutical companies starting at an ethically problematic free place. Which can't we only hope, right, that would be the case going forward. There is some concerns about the fact that the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines were developed differently than conventional vaccines. It's a new approach. And I've looked at this every different way, trying to really understand it. And it's just, above my pay grade. So could you walk us through the differences in the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines in particular? And that was one of the reasons that Operation Warp Speed was able to work, I think, is because of this different kind of approach. And people, I think, who understand parts of it, they have ethical concerns. Like, look, this is actually going to change DNA. Is that what happens?
Yes. No, it doesn't. So with conventional vaccines, well, let me start this way. What we're trying to do is get the body in its immune system to reject the virus. That's what our body does every day, all the time, is rejecting different assaults. And if we have a strong immune system, we are rejecting those assaults all the time. So to trigger in a conventional vaccine, to trigger the immune system to respond and push away a virus, what we've done is to inject a weakened or inactivated germ into our bodies. And that's why people worry sometimes about, when they think about the flu shot, is this going to give me the flu? Mm-hmm. Well, it's an inactivated virus, and so it's not going to do that. But what it does is it tells your body, act as if you have this virus, and your immune system, this is one of God's marvelous, miraculous bits of handiwork. Your immune system kicks in then and starts attacking this virus that it thinks that you have. And so you build up an immunity to the virus when it does come along. Well, in the case of these new vaccines, we're using a technology that has been developed and used in other ways, though not in a vaccine yet, called messenger RNA technology. It's genetic technology, but it doesn't alter our cells. What it does is teaches our cells to make a protein to trigger this immune response. So this messenger RNA doesn't become part of our DNA. It just tells our DNA, develop this immune response. And so it triggers that response in our bodies. And that immune response that later triggers what we call antibodies is what protects us from getting infected if the real virus enters our bodies. So our DNA is not being altered. We're not, and believe me, and you would know this as well as anybody, I'm as cautious about genetic manipulation as you'll find. This is not manipulating our genetics. It is teaching our genes, or telling our genes, do your work in creating a kind of immune response. And it's using a kind of DNA technology to do that.
Right. Well, one thing I can,
as simple as I can make it.
One thing I can absolutely vouch for in your case is that you are very concerned about unintended consequences, right? That technologies used for, healing will be used for enhancement, or technologies used to preserve life will be used to extend life, or, unethically, or to take life unethically. And again, that's the darn thing about unintended consequences, is they're unintended and often unforeseen.
Right.
Are there any unforeseen consequences here for this sort of new technology? In other words, that it could be used in chemical weapons, or or biological weaponry, or anything like that?
Well, perhaps so, but the technology is over 10 years old.
Okay.
They've been experimenting with mRNA for a long time. It's just that this is the first time it's been included in vaccine development, human vaccine development. So, might there be more side effects? That's possible, but the indication seems to be, what we know so far is that the vaccines if they have side effects, they're not long lasting and they're not severe. For most people, the side effects are relatively mild. You may have a little fever, you may have a little soreness in the spot of the injection, but there don't seem to be, we don't have long-term data here, right? But there don't seem to be right now kind of mid-range side effects that are particularly worrisome.
So another question that we have received is some early warnings that these vaccines, and it may have just been the Pfizer one, if I remember correctly in the source that I saw, potentially could render a woman infertile. And I think it had to do with the fact that the admission that these things had not been adequately tested on pregnant women. What's the update on that?
I don't know, honestly, John, and I don't want to misspeak. I don't know the latest on that myself. I do know that they're discouraging women who are trying to get pregnant from taking the vaccine, and so I think again, this is another example, in my mind, another example where our protocols are helping us to avoid unnecessarily harming people who might be harmed. So we're now telling people, if you have a history of allergic reactions to vaccines or other things, you may not want to take this vaccine right now. We're telling women who are considering getting pregnant not to take the vaccine right now. Those are good warning. They're not things that ought to make us fearful. They're things that ought to say, thank both God and our long history of studying efficacy and safety that we have these kind of protocols in place, and that we're able to make these kinds of we're able to inform patients about the potential side effects.
Is that warning more that there have been negative consequences for women trying to get pregnant, or it hasn't been adequately tested, so we don't know, so don't take the risk?
I think it has been adequately tested. We don't have enough data yet.
Yeah. Speaking of which, that's actually an ethical concern, right? I mean, back when, just as we're recording this, a group of African-American pastors. Of course, we know the African-American community has been very much hit hard by the COVID virus. Ed Stetzer, our friend with the Southern Baptist Convention and Wheaton College, has talked and reported on kind of the devastation in many African-American churches. And of course, that has to do with all kinds of things. But a group of African-American pastors basically said, we're not ready to recommend getting vaccinated. And of course, that has a lot to do with the history of how vaccinations and testings were used in a eugenics sort of way. We could think about the syphilis testing and so on, which is a horrific chapters in American history. But also there's that larger fear. That's just an example. The larger fear, by many in the population is just, look, it's called Operation Warp Speed. That's not the name you want for a vaccine because you don't want to do things that way. Talk us through that.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and I don't blame or I would never gainsay minority individuals for their caution about the ways in which majority culture has used science in ways that were harmful to them. You mentioned the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, where thousands of patients, African-American patients, were used in syphilis experiments and never told that they had syphilis. Used basically as guinea pigs, but never informed that they had syphilis, that they would continue to carry and then pass along to others. So these are very, very bleak chapters in the history of science. The question that I think is still on the table, though, is you mentioned our fatigue and our weariness with the restrictions. So if we don't take the vaccine, how much longer do we have to live with these restrictions? How much longer do we have to live with the fear that we might contract COVID? And then the question is, are the risks of not taking the vaccine worse than the risks of taking the vaccine, given the lack of long-term longitudinal data that we have? And I think that's a question everybody's going to have to answer for themselves. Are you, so today, this day that we're recording, more than 3,000 people will have died from COVID-19. Are the risks of taking the vaccine greater or lesser than that? We're gonna have to assess that ourselves. And again, I can well imagine the fear and caution of minority communities about the vaccine. I can only hope that we'll see enough good results from the development of this vaccine that those fears will begin to abate. The other thing I would say is, there are significant numbers of African Americans and Latinos who are part of the scientific community. I think we need to hear from them as well. They work for the FDA. They work for these companies. We need to hear from them as well. Are they worried about the safety of these vaccines? I think they would be helpful guides in about that. But
and there's a group, and I think they have to do more with kind of the segments of the population that are, rural, conservative in many ways, that just think that we're over vaccinating. They have concerns. Some would be anti-vaxxers. Of course, that's the nickname. Some would be, more like a lot of families I know. We might even consider ourselves one of them. That's just like, I'm not sure we need to, vaccinate everything. And that seems to be the recommendation, from doctors and protocol and so on. And that actually is a way of doing health maintenance that could undermine our immunity system in the long run. I mean, give us the stuff that'll kill us. But, and this is a hard thing from a Christian worldview. People think it's really clear. The hard thing is that God actually has called us to be co-creators. He's given humans an amazing ability to do things that are more like God than like animals, and our ability to see behind the surface, and also to heal, to be healers. These are good things, and yet we're dealing with fallen brains and fallen minds and fallen motives all at the same time. So I actually sympathize pretty well with people who struggle with that.
Sure.
Because it's not, to me, it's not just, well, the scientific, community says it. And therefore it's, we should do it.
Yeah. I mean, fair enough. But people need to do their homework. I mean, one of the things we've seen in the last year and more is an enormous number of conspiracy theories. I hope you'll do a podcast on.
We've done a couple, and we get some great emails when we do.
Yeah, because I heard somebody say today, they were watching the video of Fauci and Francis Collins and Secretary Azar getting the vaccine. And they said, notice that as the needle goes toward their arm, the needle actually doesn't go in their arm. They've made it appear to be that they're getting a vaccine, but they're not really getting the vaccine. There are rational and reasonable concerns, and then there are just things that I don't know how to reconcile that in my mind. We're saying there's a vast conspiracy that includes people of the character of Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins and Secretary Azar, who are willing to put millions of people around the world at risk by taking a fake vaccination. I mean, that just seems so unreasonable to me that it doesn't make any sense. And so I just think we have to do our homework, and everybody's going to have to come to terms with their position on the vaccine. But they're also going to have to realize that when they do that, whatever your perspective is, when you make a decision about that, you may impact others, because the protection is not primarily for you, and hopefully some of these vaccines may promise to help you as much as they do others, but they're keeping you from being an asymptomatic carrier who's going to affect other people who are more vulnerable perhaps than you are.
So let's talk, that goes back right to where we began, which is, so many of us are starting from these politically entrenched positions as opposed to starting with truth. Now, I'm not saying that biblical truth doesn't align more with one political perspective or one set of political perspectives than others. I think that's, those of us that are pro-life and pro-marriage and pro-religious liberty, some of that seems pretty obvious. But I do think, gosh, we have become as guilty as others as being what Chuck Colson would call ideological, starting there and letting that kind of become the theory of everything that explains all of life. All right, I got a couple more. You've been a trooper. Thank you, Dr. Ben Mitchell, for walking through all of these. And this is the one thing I wanted to do, was not do a hot take and not do a slogan or a meme, but slowly work through all of these. The last two have to do with the administration of this and ethical concerns. One has to do with the rationing of the vaccines. Now, this, in my mind, spawns from a couple different places. We saw what happened in Italy at the beginning of COVID, where literally people who were high risk, who were going to be high risk to die, they basically were sent home in many cases because the system was overwhelmed. At least that's the reports we heard from a number of sources. There was talk at the beginning of the vaccine, including one very, I say infamous article now that has made its rounds, which suggested that we should not prioritize at-risk populations because they tend to be, older and white. We should prioritize minorities because of the systemic injustice and that will, and I'm using their words here, balance the scales. Now, that's not I don't think that's a common, position that many would hold, but it did make it into a, popular publication. But there is that concern of rationing. Is that really kind of a short-lived concern? Is that with the size of the production and the distribution, the process being kind of smoothed out, even between the time we record this and certainly by the time this conversation airs on our podcast, what are the concerns here about rationing?
Yeah, I think it's, this is one of the first times I've really heard it described as rationing, because the area in which I work, the area of bioethics, we've had these questions all the time. Mm-hmm. They revolve around what we would call triage ethics. So think of the battlefield. You have limited resources. You have soldiers who are coming in from the battlefield. You have limited personnel to care for them. You have limited medicines and other things to care for them. Who gets care first? And in those cases, triage ethics, the people who get the care first are the people who are most likely to die if they don't get the care as quickly, and who. And then others who are less acute get the care next. And so you have this queue, this lineup of people who, with the sickest first, getting the treatment. Same is true with our organ transplantation system. If you get on the transplant list, that means you're really sick. And the sickest get the sickest meaning those who are most likely to die more quickly, they get the organ first. This is triage ethics. It happens all the time in emergency rooms around the country. So what we've said is, first of all, we have to protect the caregivers, the healthcare workers. And it's not going to do anybody any good if we don't have healthcare workers to care for them. So we give them the vaccine first. And then we look at those most vulnerable populations, the populations that are going to die of COVID quicker and in more numbers than if we didn't vaccinate them. And so, you get people in nursing homes and people who work in nursing homes. And then you use that lovely term that I always find I just find it sort of British understatement, comorbidities. We give those who have the most comorbidities the next shot, literally. Comorbidities meaning you have multiple serious health problems, heart problems, COPD, atrial fibrillation, all kinds of things. So we want to give you those. So this is triage ethics. It's not rationing in the sense that we're going to determine that some people don't get it at all. It's a question of who gets it first. And
so a social proposal I heard on a National Review podcast just recently. I thought about you because they were talking about this particular article, and I had read it already, and they were talking about ethicists, and you think about guys like Peter Singer, for example, and he's not really doing ethics. He's basically taking kind of a social agenda and doing it in the language of ethics. And I think that's the concern. I mean, there certainly is a huge difference between someone who writes an article and someone who's actually making the decisions. The challenge is that Francis Schaeffer line of despair, that these ideas that start in the academy eventually, creep their way down, like with doctor-assisted suicide and abortion and elective abortions and then sex selective abortions and, things like that. And I think that's the concern in the long run.
Yeah. I mean, I understand that. I think what the triage ethic tries to do is not let skin color or cultural biases affect the decision, but let, if you will, lab values affect the decision. What is this person's physiology, quite apart from their from their social contribution, quite apart from their whether they've got 3 kids in a house, quite apart from what their economic status is, whether they make $1,000 a year or $1 million a year. It's trying to as much as possible remove those status questions and just look at how sick and vulnerable people are. Once, of course, we get the healthcare providers protected. I mean, it makes some sense to me, and it avoids the problem of the eugenic problem that you identified, of saying, well, we're only going to let the healthy get the vaccine, and we're going to only let those who have a certain number of productive years left get the vaccine, who will contribute back to the economy. No, we're gonna take care of our old people, and we're going to take care of people who are sick and vulnerable, and we're going to take care of the disabled, and we're going to take care of people who have contributed, to culture and to society for years. We're going to take care of them because they're sick.
Fair enough. It is interesting that these conversations, or these practical conversations, are happening after a year where conversations about privilege, about identities, cultural identities, have been so prevalent, and it does complicate things quite a bit in the popular imagination. All right. Last question. There certainly is a concern by many having to do with whether vaccines should be or will be forced. And I think some people have in mind, government enforcement. We are thinking about things, like being able to enroll in schools or federal programs or anything like that. But there's also, the kind of the indirect or the passive requirements. In other words, to participate here, you have to have been vaccinated. And, you could see that from, in a year or two's time, whether it's, if you really want to travel to Hawaii, then, you have to demonstrate that you've been vaccinated, or if you want to enroll at the University of North Carolina because it's a state school, or, something along those lines of either directly forced vaccinations or passively or indirectly forced vaccinations. Walk us through the ethics around that.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see a kind of mandatory government enforced vaccination program. Now there may be certain populations within that, maybe soldiers. I don't know.
Military, sure, yeah.
See how that works out. I have a nephew who's a lieutenant in the Army right now, and they're having these discussions. What about those of us who don't yet feel the vaccine is safe and effective? Will we have to take it? And they have had this, and I don't speak for the Army either, but from his perspective, they've not had any directives handed down to them yet. Might there be employers who say we want all of our staff to have the vaccination? I think that's possible. You asked about the ethics. I think that this is an area where there is a legitimacy to questions about safety and effectiveness. I think there are still questions that none of us have the answers to. And we have to put those in the category of, other risks that we take when we don't have all the data imaginable or possible. But I think that there are enough questions that I think there should be a place for people to object to the vaccination if they're not prepared to have them, in the same way that we provide people to object to vaccinations. Other vaccinations. So I think we're going to have a place for sort of conscientious objection to the vaccine. You raised a very interesting question about universities, though. I mean, there are plenty of universities that have mandatory. You've got to show your shot card. You got to show your immunization record. Will this be added to it? I think that's probably going to be a case by case basis. And or state by state decision, and people will have to make decisions about where they want to go to college, based on their view of vaccines. But that's already the case in some of our jurisdictions where people say, I don't, my child doesn't have the MMR vaccine, and so they can't go to that school because they don't have that vaccine. We'll have to navigate that. I do think that this is a place where we need a big and a broad cultural conversation, though, and not have it handed down from some government bureaucratic office that this is what we're going to do. I don't think that'll happen. That is going to come down from just a bureaucratic decision, but I do think that we need to have a national conversation about it, maybe a global conversation about it for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, there's already obviously global implications of this.
Yeah.
You can't get into some countries unless you've
Right.
had
Right.
some shots, and some of them seem pretty shady to me and very uncomfortable. So, there's a lot of those questions. Well, hey, you've been a trooper, and we've walked through a whole lot of content, and that was really my goal in this conversation. I don't expect that we'll hear from everyone who says thank you for enlightening me, and I agree 100%. But I did know, Dr. Ben Mitchell, that with you, we would get a clear-headed, slow walk through the nuances of the conversation. And I do know you well enough to know that your concerns, first and foremost, for the inherent dignity of every single person as made in the image and likeness of God, your vision of our duty to love God and to love neighbor, and also, a pretty, I think, clear-headed vision of the scope and the scale of government, where it belongs and where it doesn't, would inform the conversation, and that we would be able to walk through and at least have this conversation with more information. Hopefully this has created a lot more light than it has heat, even if you come away listening and saying, I disagree with him there, or I think you guys missed it over here. I get that. This is a hard conversation, but what you got today was an awful lot of facts, an awful lot of data, and a clear-headed, I think, journey through the ethical questions. And it's been a significant and dense and long conversation. So I'm grateful to you, Dr. Ben Mitchell, for walking us through it all.
Well, thank you, John, and I appreciate your good work. And I don't know that I am, but I want to be worthy of your confidence. And I think this is the kind of thing we're going to have to do. We're just going to have to talk it through, look at the data, and make our own assessments about it. And I would love for us on December 23rd, 2021, we're going to come back and do a kind of retrospective, not as a way of casting blame, but just to say, hey, how did we do?
Yeah.
Was our thinking about this clear? Was it helpful? If we face this again, or when we face it again, how should we do it differently? We need some clear, just as we need clear prospective vision, we need some clear retrospective vision too.
I listen. You're on. Let's do it. Let's schedule that right now. Put it on the calendar, because we've already talked about the isolation issues, the loneliness issues. You started our whole journey through this pandemic back in, I guess, early March, just thinking through a theology of death and dying. And these are these ideologies, the way we look at disease, the way we look at each other, the way we look at our culture. These are pre-existing conditions. So we're not doing these conversations or this journey neutrally. We're doing it, loaded with worldviews and worldview assumptions. And we need to acknowledge that. And the ability to look back and go, man, we didn't bat 1,000. Maybe we did better than we think, we thought at the time. Maybe we did a lot worse. And we'll know a little bit more. We still may not know it all, but let's plan to have that conversation. Hey, let me just say, we're recording. People are probably hearing this after Christmas and after the new year, but Merry Christmas to you and your family.
And to you.
Grateful for your influence in my life and your help with so many things here at the Colson Center.
Well, thank you, John. It's been a privilege, and Merry Christmas to you. And I hope our 2021 is brighter than our 2020 has been.
May it be so.